bluffs around at sunrise were covered with Indians, to the number of 500 to 600, and fighting was commenced by their charging down over the plains. Colonel James A. Sawyers, August 1865. That account sounds a lot like it could have come from a Hollywood script from the latest Hollywood Western. You can just imagine Sawyers played by the newest version of John Wayne, and add to that this took place at a place called Bonepile Creek in Wyoming, and it does start to sound like a lot more like it was at a Hollywood soundstage. But that account really took place in August 1865, 10 miles south of modern-day Gillette, Wyoming. Hello and welcome. I'm Saratoga Museum Director Justin Horn, and welcome to the Saratoga Museum History Podcast. In this podcast, we'll explore the history of Wyoming's Platte Valley, as well as some of the history of wider Wyoming. In this episode, we're taking a look at the Battle of Bonepile Creek and the 1865 Sawyers Expedition. So a lot of this research I did when I was still up at the Rockpile Museum in Gillette, Wyoming, so it's a little bit more northern Wyoming focused, a little northern Wyoming centric in this episode. So I like to set the historical framework. So for the history buffs out there, when you hear 1865, you're immediately thinking Civil War time frame. And President Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. So most of the events I'm talking about today occurred just in the wake of the Lincoln assassination at the tail end, or the end of the Civil War. And so that further, and then the beginning of the increase in westward migration after the Civil War. For those of you a little bit more familiar with Wyoming's history, the events commonly referred to as Red Cloud's War, most of those are still in the future. So Fort Phil Kearny hadn't even been established yet. It was established in July 1866. Then with that, the Fetterman fight, or also known as the Battle of 100 in the Hand, was in December 66. The Hayfield fight, Wagon Box fight, still in the future, as well as the Fort Laramie 1868 treaty. And in fact, at this time we're talking, Wyoming hadn't even been invented yet. The Wyoming Territory itself didn't come into full existence until 1868. So the events we're talking about are a bit of a precursor to this Red Cloud's War. So one question you might be asking yourself next is, what were a bunch of white guys doing in what became Wyoming even before there was a Wyoming Territory? And the short answer to that is gold. Gold was discovered in 1863 up in the mountains and valleys of Montana around Virginia City. Think the modern-day Bozeman, Montana area. Some of the secondary sources report that in a few years, $30 million worth of gold was pulled out of the Montana mountains. So quite the find. So it sparked a gold rush. And in 1863, 64, 65, the question is, how the heck does one even get up to Montana? So early on, the best way was to follow the Great Platte River Road across southern Nebraska, the old Oregon Trail. I say old because at that point it had been trodden for over 15 years, so it was well established. You enter through Wyoming, go over South Pass, Wyoming, and into modern-day Idaho to Fort Hall, Idaho. From Fort Hall in Idaho, you would parallel a route northward, paralleling modern-day Interstate 15. A little bit of a roundabout way, so it didn't take long for guys to start to try to find shorter routes. One of them was famous mountain man Jim Bridger. He pioneered a trail through Wyoming's Bighorn River Basin on the western side of the Bighorn Mountains. Another guy was John Bozeman. So he initially went to Virginia City following the Oregon Trail route. Like so many others, he struck out and didn't find any gold, and so when he decided he wanted to return to the east, he set out east from Virginia City, followed the Yellowstone River for a while, and then made his way south on the eastern side of the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. eventually reaching the Oregon Trail. Problem with this route is that it went through the Powder River Basin, which was prime hunting ground for the Native Americans, and they were willing to defend their hunting ground, which eventually led to it being referred to as the Bloody Bozeman Trail. John Bozeman, for what he lacked in gold mining ability, he made up in marketing. So unlike Bridger, Bozeman was able to market his trail, so that's why so many going to Montana eventually followed the Bozeman route. But looking at the map, another guy decided that there's probably even a shorter route to get there. So this was Congressman Ashel Hubbard, and he was a congressman from Iowa representing a district of Sioux City, Iowa. And so he thought if you follow the Niobrara River across northern Nebraska and then cut through the Powder River Basin, that would be the shortest route to the Montana goldfields. And this route, obviously, he was in favor of because that meant the jumping off point, the start of the route, was Sioux City, Iowa. And so if successful, that could spark Sioux City becoming a new gateway to the west and transferring all the power and influence that Council Bluffs and Omaha were gaining, and transfer that all to the growing Sioux City. So Congressman Hubbard, being a congressman, he was able to secure $10,000 from Congress for a road building adventure. But of course, being a congressman, he's not going to go himself. So he needed a guy to lead the expedition, so enter James Alexander Sawyers. Sawyers had been born in Tennessee. He served in the Mexican-American War, much like his more famous counterpart, Ulysses S. Grant. Served in the Mexican-American War. After the war, returned to civilian life. Sawyers became a merchant and moved to Sioux City, Iowa. And then at the outbreak of the Civil War, he rejoined the Union Army. He served with the Sioux City Cavalry and then eventually became the commander of a unit known as the Northern Border Brigade. And their mission was to protect Iowa from any Confederate raiders. By the fall of 1864, the units disbanded and Sawyers receives a discharge. Reason being, at that point, they're at the end of their enlistment and General Sherman's sacking Atlanta, so there's not much point to having a unit protecting Iowa at that point in the Civil War. So for his expedition to Montana, Sawyers puts together a civilian wagon train. This is fundamentally a civilian expedition with 196 men and 25 wagons, as well as a team of 36 freight wagons. The Teamsters are led by James Sawyer's younger brother, Newell Sawyers, and the expedition does receive a military escort of 118 men from the 5th U.S. Volunteer Infantry, provisioned for 3 months. Congressman Hubbard had initially promised Sawyers a 200-man escort, and so Sawyers protested at the only getting 118 men, so they were able to convince the Army to give Sawyers another 25 men from Company B of the 1st Battalion, Dakota Cavalry. The military escort fell under the command of Captain George W. Williford, and this proved to be one of the beginnings of the troubles of the expedition, in that Captain Williford and Sawyers did not get along before the end. Sawyers would call Williford faint-hearted, and Williford would call Sawyers incompetent. So much like a movie, I began this saying it's a lot like a movie script. So much like a movie, we can imagine Sawyers and his expedition leaving Sioux City, Iowa in June and making their way through northern Nebraska following the Niobrara River in July 1865. And just like a movie, we can fade to black and pick up a B subplot. And so on the screen would appear a big 9 months earlier. So 9 months earlier takes us to November 1864, and we're going down to southern Colorado. So southern Colorado, home to Bent's Fort, as well as a site today is run by the National Park Service, the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. So you could do a whole another episode podcast on this, but in a brief nutshell, Sand Creek, the Colorado militia, attacked a group of Southern Cheyenne camped along Sand Creek, peacefully camped there, and massacred the group of Cheyenne. One of the guys camped with the Cheyenne was a man by the name of George Bent, and he lived quite an interesting life. So George Bent, he was the son of fur trader William Bent of Bent's Fort fame, and he was the son of George Bent was the son of white fur trader William Bent of Bent's Fort fame and a Native American Cheyenne woman. So George Bent had 1 foot in the white world, 1 foot in the Native American world. When the Civil War outbroke, he was actually in Missouri, so initially he joined with the Missouri Confederate Cavalry. But by the fall of 1864, he was back in Colorado, and he was at that time living with his mother's people, camped at Sand Creek. So he was there during the massacre, and in fact, he was shot and wounded in the hip, and so he had to crawl to safety. And so George Bent, along with the other survivors of Sand Creek, they made their way north and joined with their Northern Cheyenne cousins and Lakota allies, and they began raiding along the North and South Platte rivers. Big attack came in January 1865 when the Native Americans attacked Julesburg, Colorado, and Fort Sedgwick. And then they continued north to Mud Springs, Nebraska. And one account I read sounds, again, just like a movie. You can imagine the Native American Indians surrounding the telegraph office and the telegraph operator frantically trying to get a message out saying, hey, we're under attack. And he gets the message out just in time right before the Indians cut the telegraph line. So he is able to get his message out to Fort Laramie just in time. But of course, telegraph lines cut, so they have no idea if help is on the way. But Fort Laramie received their message. So the commander of Fort Laramie, Colonel William Collins, got a group of soldiers together and they rode through the night to the relief of Mud Springs. They got into a running fight with the Native Americans, culminating in Rush Creek, in which the Native Americans crossed the frozen Platte River, and Colonel Collins had the good sense not to follow them any further. Raids continued along the Platte Rivers, culminating in July 1865 with the Battle of Platte Bridge, which is by modern-day Casper, Wyoming. And of course, Casper gets its name from this battle because during this battle, the young Lieutenant Casper Collins, son of William Collins, was killed. So you've heard Fort Collins, Colorado. That was named after his father, Colonel Collins. And so since that name was already taken, they named the town Casper instead of Collins. So that's where Casper, Wyoming gets its name. Just a little side trivia. But this Battle of Platte Bridge took place July 26, 1865, and that gets us back up to Sawyers. So late July, Sawyers has made his way through Nebraska following the Niobrara, and at this point he is in what is now modern-day South Dakota, in the very southwest corner of South Dakota following the Cheyenne River. So he's about in the area of modern-day Angostura Reservoir, south of Hot Springs, South Dakota, if you're familiar with that area. In the wake of the Battle of Platte Bridge Station, General Grenville Dodge, the commander of the district, ordered his subordinate General Patrick Connor to, quote, make vigorous war upon the Indians to punish them so that they will be forced to keep the peace. To accomplish this task, Connor set out on a massive expedition known as the Powder River Expedition, in which he organized 3 columns. The eastern right column was led by Colonel Nelson Cole when they left from Omaha, Nebraska, following the Loup River westward. There was a central column led by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Walker, and they left from Fort Laramie, and they were to skirt around the eastern side of the Black Hills. And the left western column was led by Connor himself, and they traveled from Fort Laramie into the Powder River country. And it's this left western column which we're mostly concerned with our story. So General Connor is at Fort Laramie gearing up for this expedition, and at this time, as I said, Sawyers and his expedition are in modern-day South Dakota around the area of Angostura Reservoir on the Cheyenne River. And on July 21st, Captain Williford comes to Sawyers with a bit of a problem. As I briefly mentioned at the beginning, the Sawyers Expedition the Army had 3 months worth of supplies. Well, we're about 6 weeks into this journey, and they're running out of supplies. So Sawyers blames Williford for the not counting the supplies correctly, and Williford blames Sawyers as overall commander. Regardless of whose fault it actually was, the fact is the supplies are running low and they need more. So Sawyers authorizes the quartermaster, Lieutenant Daniel M. Dana, to take off to head to Fort Laramie in an attempt to secure the supplies. And so you can just imagine a scene. It took Lieutenant Dana 10 days to make it to Fort Laramie and to return, and you can kind of imagine the scene. Sawyer sees Lieutenant Dana returning. Oh, good, Lieutenant, you're back. Wait a minute, where are the supplies? So, unfortunately for the Sawyers Expedition, Lieutenant Dana was unable to secure any supplies at Fort Laramie because General Connor's gearing up for a massive expedition, so all the supplies at the fort are going with the general. But the good news for Sawyers is that Dana was able to return with the news that Connor was indeed taking off in the roughly same direction as Sawyers on his own expedition. So Sawyers would know in the back of his mind that the main army, was in the area. With the news that they were unable to secure any supplies from Fort Laramie, Captain Williford wants to call the expedition off and return to civilization. Sawyers is undeterred, and so he orders the expedition to press on. They enter what is now modern Wyoming on August 1st and begin skirting their way around the western side of the Black Hills, passing by modern-day Newcastle, Wyoming, and then entering the Powder River Basin. They cross the Belle Fourche River, and on August 9th, they make a camp on a little creek called Caballo. While camped on August 9th at Caballo, Sawyers, quote, finds large quantities of first-rate bituminous coal, the best I have ever seen in the West, and from the amount seen cropping out, I should think it almost inexhaustible, end quote. Since Sawyers also wrote about seeing coal seams on fire and large quantities of coal. And this is interesting because that camp on Caballo is now the modern-day site of Caballo Mine, one of the large coal mines in Campbell County, which makes Campbell County and Gillette the energy capital of the nation it is today. So from their camp on Caballo Creek on August 9th, they leave, heading westward toward the Powder River, and they reach the Powder on August 11th. And at this point, Sawyers makes what at first glance seems like a very curious decision. He decides to turn the expedition around. And so, why? So there's 3 reasons why Sawyers would make a U-turn at the Powder. The first is that they're traveling in August. It's hot, probably 100 degrees, and it's dry. And so they write in their reports that the cattle and livestock were suffering from lack of water. And without accurate maps going forward, they didn't know how far it would be to the next water source after leaving the Powder. The next reason is that they did send scouts out, and the scouts reported that the terrain on the Powder River was impassable for the wagons, which is perfectly believable if you're familiar with that part of Wyoming. It's very rough country. And the third reason is that those same scouts also reported seeing signs of Indians. And Sawyers, not wanting to get into any scuffles with the Native Americans, decides to turn around. So Sawyers' goal is to return to their camp on Caballo Creek and then head southward and go around the southern side of a geographic feature known as the Pumpkin Buttes, and that would take them then to the route of the Bozeman Trail. So on their return journey, 19-year-old teamster Nathaniel Hedges is scouting ahead looking for water, and he finds a source of water at a small stagnant creek on the maps called Bonepile. And at this point, there were some Native Americans there, and they actually attack and kill Hedges. and then they make a run for Sawyers' main party, attempting to run off the livestock. Sawyers and his men are able to corral their wagons and make a rudimentary fortification on a small knoll overlooking the Bonepile Creek. And one of the men in the Dakota Cavalry with them was John Colby Griggs, and Private Griggs wrote that night, quote, "No one was allowed to sleep tonight," end quote, for fear of Indian attack. Griggs also wrote that in his account of the action that he thought Sawyers and his men were able to kill 10 Native American warriors, where Sawyers lost no one else after Hedges had been killed, and that they were able to recover the body of the scalped Hedges. It was during this little standoff that Sawyer sent out some of the men to the nearby hilltops to act as pickets and lookouts. And so one of the hilltops was manned by a Dakota cavalryman, Private Uric Jarvis. And so one account written by one of the guys records that Private Jarvis was manning his picket on the hilltop, and 10 to 15 Cheyenne tried to sneak up on him. Fortunately for Jarvis, he heard the warriors coming and was able to make his escape, running down the hill, firing warning shots to alert the rest of the Sawyers Expedition. And with the, quote, "speed of the wind," Jarvis made his escape, losing only his hat. And it's a little bit of a humorous account. Years later, in 1930, an artist, L.W. Aldrich, painted the Sawyers Wagon Road, and the painting is with the State Museum, State Archives in Cheyenne, and it depicts Jarvis, and you can see his hat being blown off as he's running away. So if you're able to go to the Bonepile site today, which it's on private land, so you do need permission, but you're able to see little divots on this little hill, and that is actually the rifle pits where the Sawyers men were corralled with their rudimentary fortifications. And the site's about 10 miles south of Gillette. And interestingly enough, it's within sight of the Prairie Sky wedding venue. So nowadays, modern day, people get married and have their weddings at this fancy wedding venue. Kind of interesting to think that back in 1865, there was a raging battle taking place there. So Sawyers, not feeling that this little knoll was necessarily the best place for them to be, the most defensible, during a break in the action, he elects to try to move back to the Caballo Creek site, which is about 10 miles away. And so Sawyers and his men, they make a break for it, heading back to the Caballo Creek site. And they reach the Caballo Creek site, and there they dig in. So we have now a second set of rudimentary fortifications built by the Sawyers party. This site is at the Caballo Creek site. So back in 1997, a group of archaeologists were able to excavate the site, and their findings, they found a lot of Civil War era buttons, a lot of musket balls, and so that was a definitive proof that yes, indeed, Sawyers and his men were there. So cool that the archaeology backs up what we know from the historical records. So now Sawyers and his men, they're camped along Caballo Creek, dug in, and at this point, Sawyers raises the white flag of truce and goes out to meet with the Native Americans. And so one of the Native Americans who's there, who Sawyers meets with, is our friend George Bent. So George Bent, since he spoke English, he acted as interpreter between Sawyers and the Native Americans. In his autobiography, Bent wrote, quote, "The Indians kept the train corralled for 4 days, fighting most of the time, but the warriors did not make a serious attack, only desiring to secure some plunder. After one of the attacks, Sawyers and Captain Williford came out of the corral to hold a talk, and I went forward with one of the Cheyenne chiefs to meet them. I acted as interpreter. At the close of the talk, Sawyers offered to buy off the Indians, promising to give them a wagon load of goods if they would stop attacking his outfit. The chief agreed to this, and the goods were handed over." End quote. So not everyone was thrilled with this outcome. Captain Williford said that Sawyers was buying off the hostiles, and if we remember, supplies for the party were already low, so Sawyers giving the Indians a wagon load of supplies only further irritated Williford because he knew how low the supplies were getting. At this point, the historical record gets a little murky. So now that there's a peace between Sawyers and the Native Americans, it seems like some of the men took the opportunity to actually try to trade with the natives. And so the Sawyers men and so the natives were meeting and trying to trade. And the most likely thing that happened is that one of the trades went south and tensions were still high, because the next report is that shots were being fired. In the melee, two of Sawyers' men, Privates Anthony Nelson and John Rouse, were missing. And at this point, Sawyers and his men opened up fire on the Native Americans with their two 12-pound mountain howitzer cannon. And that killed several of the natives' horses. And at that point, the natives decided that they had got their wagon a load of supplies and they weren't going to get any more out of Sawyers, so they took off. Sawyers and his men, they were able to recover the body of Private Nelson, but were unable to find the body of Private John Rouse, leading both Albert Holman, one of the Teamsters, and Private John Griggs of the party to speculate that Rouse actually had deserted. Whether he deserted or whether his body was laying in a ravine and never recovered, I guess that's one of the things, unfortunately, we'll never know. So now Sawyers, he knows that the Indians have taken off, but he doesn't know how far they've gone or if they'll be back. So him and his men are corralled in their fortifications at Caballo Creek. And so Sawyers elects to send out some scouts in an attempt to find General Connor, because Sawyers knows that Connor is not too terribly far away. So Sawyers' scouts, they leave and ride apparently 150 miles in just 50 hours, which is an incredible ride. They are able to find Connor at the newly established Fort Reno in what is southern-day Johnson County, Wyoming. So from the newly established Fort Reno, they ride back to Sawyers, reaching Sawyers on August 9th. They report that General Connor is crossing the Powder River with a large expedition, and the Cheyenne Indians are moving northward, leaving this road south of the Pumpkin Buttes clear. So why are the Indians moving further northward and leaving Sawyers? I speculate that's because of General Connor's expedition. So on August 13th, the very same day Nathaniel Hedges was killed at Bonepile Creek, there was another fight occurring not too far away, this at Crazy Woman Creek. General Connor's Pawnee scouts, led by a Captain Frank North, engaged with a group of Cheyenne Indians at the Crazy Woman Creek. In this skirmish, Captain North had his horse shot out from under him, but he was undeterred, so he followed the Cheyenne Indians along Crazy Woman Creek to the confluence of the Powder to a large Cheyenne Indian camp. I also speculation that large camp at the confluence of the Crazy Woman and Powder was the camp that Sawyers' scouts saw, which prompted Sawyers to one of the reasons he made his decision to turn around at the Powder. So Captain Frank North, he attacks this Indian camp, killing 24 Native Americans, including George Bent's stepmother, Yellow Woman. And so Captain North, he lived an interesting life too, almost worthy of his own podcast. He was friends with Buffalo Bill Cody, so he was a manager on Cody's Wild West show, and he also was one of the guys who worked with Cody at his North Platte ranch. So Captain Frank North is harassing the Indians in northern Johnson County, Wyoming, and so that leaves the area of southern Johnson County, Wyoming clear for Sawyers and his men, so they're able to go around the southern side of the Pumpkin Buttes and reach the newly established Fort Reno on August 24th. Connor's not there. Connor and his main expedition have continued on further north, but Connor leaves word that for the Sawyers party, that Captain Williford and his group of 5th U.S. Volunteers are to remain at the fort, and that the 6th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry will further escort Sawyers. So Williford is left at command at Fort Reno, which I'm sure he was very happy about, given that he was not wanting to continue on the expedition. Although unfortunately for Williford, it didn't work out so well for him. He remained at Fort Reno in command through the winter of 1865-66, and in April of 66 he fell ill, likely of cholera, and he actually died at the fort. But returning back to late August 1865, Williford remains at command at Fort Reno, and Sawyers, now with the 6th Michigan, they continue northward on what is the Bozeman Trail. So they go northward, crossing the Crazy Woman Creek on August 26, crossing Clear Creek now by modern-day Buffalo, Wyoming on August 28th, and they pass by Lake DeSmet on August 29th, blissfully unaware that a massacre is taking place about 30 miles to their north. So, as I said, General Connor, his expedition, they're continuing on further north. So General Connor is about 30 miles north of Sawyers. So while Sawyers is at Lake DeSmet, General Connor is fighting what became known as Connor's Battle, Connor's Massacre, or sometimes the Tongue River Fight. The story with that is that as Connor is making his way north, he has a guide, famous mountain man Jim Bridger. He's back in the story. Bridger seems to be just everywhere when you start looking at the history of Wyoming. But Bridger's with Connor, and he apparently sees smoke off in the horizon. And one account I read is that Connor, even with binoculars, couldn't see it, but he has the good sense to trust Jim Bridger. So he sends Bridger and some scouts out, and sure enough, there's a large Arapaho village. So now with this information, Connor makes his plan of attack, and on August 29th, 1865, he attacks the village, killing 63 warriors, taking 8 women and 13 children captive, along with many of the Native Americans' horses. And as with Captain Frank North's Crazy Woman Skirmish, this Connor battle has great impact on the Sawyers Expedition. So a few days later, Sawyers is right behind Connor. So as they're making their way in northern Wyoming, we're almost at the Montana border now. Sawyers and his men are going to cross the Tongue River. And on August 31st, Captain Osmond Cole of the 6th Michigan is surrounded and killed by Arapaho Indians as they're preparing to cross the Tongue River. This forces Sawyers to once again corral the wagons and make a rudimentary fortification. And just like before, this time Sawyers and his men, they look up to find themselves surrounded by 250 to 300 Arapahoes. So once again, Sawyers finds himself surrounded by Indians. The Arapahoes, they're just assuming that Sawyers is with Connor, who just massacred their village. So they're not too happy with Sawyers being there. Sawyers is able to meet under a white flag of truce with the Arapaho, and they're able to come to an agreement. The agreement being that they're going to send 3 Arapahoes and 3 white soldiers to go out and find General Connor. Reason being, the Arapahoes want to find Connor and ask him to give them back their horses and their women and children. And Sawyers wants to send a message to Connor saying, "Help, we're under attack, please save us." Now, back in August, it was extremely hot weather, whereas now we're in early September and the weather has completely done a 180. There's accounts of snowfall, as well as thunderstorms, intense rain, and that all the creeks are beginning to flood, making travel almost impossible. So it takes a total of 2 weeks for the message to get to Connor, and then for Connor to send a relief to Sawyers. So the 3 Arapaho and 3 whites, they eventually do find Connor. Connor agrees to release the women and children because they're proving more hassle than they're worth to him, and he sends Sawyers a relief party in the form of Captain Albert Brown and a group of Company L from the 2nd California Cav. Again, because of the high creeks and rain and mud, it takes a total of 2 weeks for this to transpire. So during these 2-week periods, Sawyers and his men are camped along the Tongue River surrounded by the Arapaho. And you can imagine after 2 weeks of this, Sawyer's men, they're getting pretty fed up with the whole situation. And so they vote and held an election, and they vote to relieve Sawyers of command. Sawyers says that the men are acting impulsively, and so he invites them to reconsider, which they gladly do. They hold a second vote, and they vote to relieve him of command again. So Sawyers is out, and now with Sawyers out, the men, they elect to return to Fort Laramie as quickly as possible. And they get a bit of a break because the next morning they wake up to find that the Arapaho have left. All right, good news. All right, let's pack up the wagons. We're heading south. We're getting the heck out of Dodge. Well, there's a good reason that the Arapaho left, and that is because they knew Captain Albert Brown and the 2nd California Cav were on their way. So as the men are beginning to pack up and break camp and try to get back to Fort Reno and then Fort Laramie, Captain Albert Brown arrives. And he finds out about the situation, about how they kicked Sawyers out of command. And in Captain Brown's view, this is mutiny, and he tells the men that the penalty for mutiny on the plains is death. Now, whether Captain Brown would have had the authority to execute anyone for mutiny on what is essentially a civilian expedition, I'm not too sure about, but the threat alone was enough that the men restore Sawyers to command, and with Sawyers back in command and the Arapaho gone, Sawyers, he wants to press on, cross the Tongue River, and enter Montana. So Sawyers and his men, they press on, reaching the Bighorn River in Montana on September 19th, crossing it, and then eventually making their way to Virginia City on October 12th, 1865, without any further incident. So they've reached their goal and make it to Virginia City. So what are we to make of Sawyers' expedition? Well, General Dodge wrote, quote, while its essential object was to survey and make a good road through the country comparatively unknown, its real purpose seems to have been to take a wagon train through instead of making a road. So General Dodge, end quote, General Dodge is unimpressed with Sawyers' expedition. Sawyers himself thinks there's a good road there to be made, and so he returns east and goes and gets a second expedition together. This time, the next year in 1866, he leads a second party through the Powder River following his Niobrara route. And this time, they're lucky and they don't encounter any of the Indians, and they make it to Virginia City without any issues, which is a little bit surprising because way at the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned 1866. That's the year you start to get the Red Cloud's War, the Fetterman Massacre. So the fact that Sawyers was able to make it through in 1866 without any Indian attack was very lucky for him. But ultimately, the Niobrara route faced the same problems as the Bozeman Trail, so fighting in the Powder River country, as well as the Transcontinental Railroad reaching Cheyenne and further west, making it not necessary for a route along the Niobrara River in Nebraska. So thank you for listening to the Saratoga History Museum podcast. I'm Justin Horn, and have a good one.